The scream came before the sun rose, and it belonged to no one Elena Vasquez recognized. She sat up in bed, heart hammering, certain for one terrifying second that the sound had come from her own throat. It had not. It came from outside her window, rolling across the pack grounds like thunder trapped inside a howl, and it carried a name she knew better than her own. Damien. She was on her feet before she finished the thought, bare feet slapping cold stone as she crossed her small room and threw open the shutters. Below her, the training yard was chaos. Torches had been knocked from their brackets. Warriors who should have been sleeping were sprinting toward the eastern wall, weapons half drawn, faces stretched tight with a fear Elena had only seen once before, on the night the Alpha King's own mother had died. Something was wrong. Something was very wrong, and it had happened fast, the way disasters always did, arriving without the courtesy of warning. Elena did not stop to change out of her nightclothes. She grabbed the leather satchel she kept by the door, the one filled with bandages and salves, and the sharp silver needles she used to stitch wounds that would not heal on their own, and she ran. 3 months. It had only been 3 months since Damien Cross, Alpha King of the Cross Pack, had stood before the entire gathering under a full moon and rejected her as his mate. 3 months since she had felt the bond between them tear apart like paper, since she had watched his golden eyes go flat and cold as he spoke the words that ended everything before it had truly begun. She had not cried. She remembered that clearly, remembered the way her own composure had unsettled the crowd more than tears ever could have. She had walked away with her spine straight and her chin level, and she had told herself that dignity was the only thing left that no one could take from her. She had not expected to still love him. She had not expected the bond, severed or not, to keep tugging at her ribs every single night since, a phantom ache, in a place where something living used to be. And she had certainly not expected to be sprinting across the yard at 4 in the morning, because some instinct deeper than reason told her that whatever had made that scream, it involved him. The crowd near the eastern wall parted for her without being asked. Healers earned that kind of respect in every pack, rejected mate or not, and Elena pushed through gasps and murmurs until she reached the center of it all. Damien Cross was on his knees in the dirt. She had never once seen him like this. The Alpha King stood taller than any wolf in 3 territories, carried himself like a mountain that had decided to walk, and commanded silence simply by entering a room. Now he knelt in the dust with his claws sunk into the earth, his back arched at an unnatural angle, and a sound tearing out of him that was not quite human, and not quite wolf, something caught painfully between the two. Gareth, his beta, crouched beside him, hands hovering uselessly, afraid to touch, afraid not to. He collapsed, Gareth said, the moment he spotted Elena, relief cracking his voice. Mid-patrol. No warning, no attack. He just went down screaming, and he will not shift back. Elena did not waste time asking why no one had woken her sooner. She dropped to her knees in front of Damien, satchel forgotten, and reached for his face with both hands, tilting it up toward the torchlight. His eyes met hers, and what she saw there stopped her breath. They were not gold anymore. They were not any color a wolf's eyes should be. A black spreading darkness bled outward from his pupils, consuming the iris inch by inch, like ink dropped into water. Veins stood out along his temples in sharp black lines, pulsing in time with his ragged breathing, and where his claws had torn into the dirt, the skin around his knuckles had begun to blister and crack. Damien, she said his name the way she used to, before the rejection, before the silence, and something in him responded to it even now, his head turning fractionally toward her voice, like a compass finding north. Look at me. Tell me what happened. He could not answer in words. What came out instead was a growl so low it seemed to come from the ground itself, and then his whole body convulsed, spine bowing further, and the black lines along his temples spread another inch toward his jaw. Elena had spent 6 years training as a pack healer. She had stitched wounds from claws and blades, had pulled poison from bloodstreams with her bare hands, had sat beside dying elders, and eased their passing with nothing but herbs and patience. She had never once seen anything like this. "Someone get me light," she snapped, and the authority in her voice cut through the crowd's panic like a blade. Torches were brought closer. She peeled back the collar of his shirt, already soaked through with sweat, and found more of the black veining branching across his collarbone, thin as spider silk and spreading visibly, even as she watched. This was not an injury. This was not sickness in any form she had studied. This was something being done to him. Poison, she said aloud, thinking through it as she spoke, the way she always did, when a diagnosis mattered more than composure. But not one I recognize. It is not slowing him down. It is not making him weak. It is doing the opposite. Look at his strength. He should not be able to kneel upright through convulsions like this, not without help, and he is doing it without even trying. Wolfsbane does the opposite, Gareth offered, voice tight. Wolfsbane weakens. This is not Wolfsbane. Elena pressed 2 fingers to the pulse point at Damien's throat and felt his heart slamming against his ribs at a speed that should have killed a normal man twice over. His heart is not failing. It is racing, like something is forcing it to work harder than it should, like something is trying to burn him from the inside, instead of poisoning him from within. Around her, the crowd had gone utterly silent, the kind of silence that came from fear too large to voice. The Alpha King, the strongest wolf any of them had ever known, was on his knees, and none of them knew how to help him. Then Damien's hand shot out and closed around Elena's wrist. His grip was bruising, far stronger than he should have had control over in this state, and for one horrifying second, Elena thought the darkness had taken him completely, that whatever this was, had stripped away the man she once knew, and left only violence behind. But his eyes, still bleeding black at the edges, found hers, and held them. And in that fractured, straining moment, she saw something underneath the pain that looked almost like recognition, almost like relief. "Elena," he rasped, her name dragged out of him like it cost him everything he had left. "Do not let them see." "See what?" she asked, even as she gently pried his fingers from her wrist, careful not to hurt him further. "Damien, what is happening to you?" He did not answer. His head fell back, throat working, and the black veins reached his jaw at last, framing his face in dark lines, like cracks spreading across glass. Whatever strength had let him kneel upright abandoned him all at once, and he collapsed forward, unconscious before he hit the ground, Gareth barely catching him in time to keep his skull from striking stone. For a long moment, nobody moved. Then Elena was moving for all of them, barking orders with the crisp efficiency that had made her the pack's most trusted healer despite her age. "Get him to the healing house, now. Gently mind his spine. Whatever this is, it has weakened the connective tissue along his back. I need boiled water, clean linen, and every jar of activated charcoal in my stores. Someone find Beta Gareth II and have her seal the eastern gate. Nobody in or out until I understand what we are dealing with." The warriors obeyed instantly, 4 of them lifting Damien's massive frame with the careful reverence of men carrying something sacred, and the crowd finally began to disperse, murmuring, frightened, glancing back over their shoulders, as if the darkness that had claimed their alpha might reach out and claim them too. Elena did not follow immediately. She stayed crouched where he had knelt, staring down at the earth where his claws had torn deep gouges into the ground, and where a thin residue, dark and faintly shimmering under torchlight, coated the soil like oil. She dipped 2 fingers into it, careful not to touch her skin directly, and lifted it toward the torch to study the color. It was not blood. It was not any plant extract she had ever encountered in her studies. It smelled faintly of something metallic, and something else beneath that, something almost sweet, almost like rot dressed up in perfume. Someone had done this to him deliberately. No poison this specific occurred naturally in the wild, not in a concentration strong enough to overwhelm an Alpha King's constitution within minutes. This had been prepared, measured, delivered with purpose. Which meant someone inside or near the pack wanted Damien Cross dead, or worse, wanted him transformed into something no longer recognizably himself. Elena rose to her feet, wiped her fingers carefully on a cloth from her satchel, and looked toward the healing house where torchlight glowed gold against the windows. 3 months ago, this man had rejected her in front of everyone she knew, had severed a bond she had not asked for and could not have refused, had left her to rebuild her dignity, out of nothing but sheer will. She owed him nothing. She had told herself that every single night since, had repeated it like a prayer meant to keep her heart from reaching for something that would only wound her again. And yet here she was, already walking toward the healing house at a pace just short of running, because whatever was eating him alive from the inside out, she intended to stop it. Inside, the healing house had already come alive with movement. Warriors laid Damien across the largest bed, and 2 junior healers Elena had trained herself worked quickly to strip away his ruined shirt, revealing more of the black veining, now crawling across his chest in intricate spreading branches, like a tree growing beneath his skin. "His breathing is getting shallower," one of the healers reported, voice trembling. Elena crossed the room in 4 strides and pressed her palm flat against his sternum, feeling the erratic stutter of his heartbeat beneath her hand. She closed her eyes for 1 second, forcing her own breathing to steady, refusing to let fear cloud the clarity she needed now more than ever. "Bring me the charcoal," she said, "and the silver-infused water from the sealed jar in the back cabinet. If this is a poison built to attack a wolf's constitution specifically, silver may slow its spread, even if it cannot stop it outright." The healers scrambled to obey. Elena worked with steady hands, forcing a diluted charcoal mixture between Damien's lips, tilting his head to help him swallow despite his unconscious state, watching his throat move in weak, reluctant pulls. It was not much, it might not be enough, but it was something, and something was better than watching him die in silence while she stood by uselessly. Gareth appeared in the doorway, his face pale beneath his dark skin, hands still trembling from having carried his alpha's dead weight across the compound. "Will he live?" "I do not know," Elena said honestly, "because false comfort would serve no one in a moment like this. I have never encountered a poison like this before. I do not know what it wants from him, or what happens once it finishes spreading." "Someone did this," Gareth said, and it was not a question. "Someone did this," Elena agreed, dabbing a cool cloth against Damien's fevered forehead, watching the black lines pulse faintly beneath his skin, like something breathing. "And whoever they are still inside these walls." Gareth's jaw tightened, and for a moment, the mild-mannered beta looked every bit as dangerous as the alpha he served. "Then we find them, tonight. Tonight you protect this room," Elena corrected firmly, not looking up from her work. "Whoever did this may come back to finish what they started, and I need every second of concentration I have to keep him breathing until morning. Send trusted guards to the doors. No one enters without your direct word, not even pack council members. I do not care whose loyalty is above suspicion. Tonight, everyone is a suspect until proven otherwise." Gareth hesitated only a moment before nodding sharply and disappearing to carry out her orders, leaving Elena alone with her 2 junior healers and the unconscious body of the man who had once, briefly, promised to be her whole future before deciding she was not worth keeping. She looked down at his face now, slack with unconsciousness, the black veins still spreading with agonizing slowness across his throat, and felt something twist painfully behind her ribs, something that had nothing to do with professional concern and everything to do with a bond that refused to accept it had been broken. "You do not get to die," she whispered, low enough that only she could hear it, low enough that it could remain her secret even if he survived to remember nothing of this night. "Not like this. Not before you understand what you threw away." Outside, the sky had begun to lighten toward dawn, gray creeping in at the edges of the horizon, and somewhere within the pack's walls, whoever had poisoned their Alpha King was almost certainly watching, waiting to see whether their work had succeeded. Elena pressed a fresh cloth to Damien's forehead, steadied her breathing, and settled in for what she suspected would be the longest night of her life. The hours crawled forward with agonizing slowness. Around midnight, the black veins had reached his jaw. By the time the moon dipped low toward the horizon, they had crept down his forearms as well, threading beneath his skin like something alive and searching for purchase. Elena barely left his side, alternating between charcoal doses, cooling cloths, and careful examination of every inch of exposed skin, searching for any change that might tell her more about what she was fighting. Around 3 a.m, Damien's eyes snapped open. Elena startled back, nearly knocking over a jar of salve, as his gaze fixed on the ceiling, unseeing, the black bleeding fully across both irises now, leaving nothing of the gold she remembered. His chest heaved. A low, continuous growl built in his throat, and his hands curled into fists against the sheets, claws lengthening despite his lack of conscious control. "He is shifting involuntarily," one of the junior healers gasped, backing toward the wall. "No," Elena said sharply, though her own pulse had spiked with alarm. "Not shifting. Fighting something. Look at his muscles. They are locked, not loosening the way they would during a true shift." She moved closer, despite every instinct screaming at her to keep distance, and placed both hands flat against his chest, leaning her weight down to hold him still. "Damien, I need you to listen to my voice. Whatever this is, you are stronger than it. You have always been stronger than everything that has come for you." His growl deepened, and for one terrible moment, she thought he might lash out at her, the way an animal in agony sometimes struck out at the hand trying to help it. Instead, his body slowly, painfully, began to still beneath her palms, his breathing evening out fraction by fraction, the black in his eyes retreating just slightly toward the edges, revealing a thin ring of gold at the very center. "There," Elena breathed, relief flooding through her chest. "There you are." His gaze found hers, and though the black still dominated, that thin ring of gold fixed on her face with an intensity that made her breath catch. His lips moved, forming words with visible effort, his voice a wrecked whisper of what it should have been. Should not have. "Let you go." Elena's hands went still against his chest, whether it was the poison speaking, some delirious fragment surfacing from wherever his rational mind had retreated to, or the truth finally clawing its way free after 3 months of silence, she could not say. She only knew that hearing it now, with him half consumed by something dark enough to kill him, hurt more than the original rejection ever had. "Save your strength," she said instead, voice carefully even, refusing to let herself hope for anything more than his survival tonight. "We can discuss regrets once you are well enough to mean them." His eyes held hers a moment longer, before the black surged forward again, swallowing the gold entirely, and his body convulsed once more, before sinking into a deeper, more exhausted stillness. Not the frantic thrashing from before, but something quieter, something that, for the first time since this nightmare began, looked less like a body fighting for survival, and more like a body finally, cautiously, beginning to win. Elena did not move from his side for the rest of the night. She monitored his breathing, his pulse, the slow and uneven retreat of the black veining across his skin, documenting every change in a small leather notebook she kept for exactly this purpose. By the time the sun finally crested the eastern hills, painting the healing house windows gold, the darkness beneath Damien's skin had receded to faint gray shadows along his collarbone, no longer spreading, no longer pulsing with that terrible rhythm. He would live. She was almost certain of it now. But as she finally allowed herself to sit back in her chair, exhaustion crashing over her all at once, Elena's mind turned toward the darker question waiting beneath her relief. Someone within these walls had wanted their alpha king dead, or transformed into something monstrous enough that death might have been the kinder outcome. They had planned it carefully, prepared a poison unlike anything in her considerable knowledge, and delivered it close enough to strike during a routine patrol, in the dead of night, when suspicion would be slowest to catch up to them. And whoever they were still out there, almost certainly watching, almost certainly already planning what to try next. Elena looked down at Damien's sleeping face, at the man who had broken her heart in front of the entire pack, and then, in his most vulnerable moment, whispered words she had spent 3 months telling herself she would never hear. Protecting him tonight had been instinct, training, the unbreakable pull of a bond that refused to fully die even after rejection. Protecting him tomorrow, and every day after, until she found whoever had done this, and made certain they never tried again. That was a choice. And Elena Vasquez, healer, rejected mate, and the only person who had refused to beg when her alpha turned her away, made that choice without hesitation. She was not finished with Damien Cross yet. Not even close. Damien slept for 2 full days. Elena barely left the healing house during that time, catching brief naps in a chair pulled close to his bedside, waking at the smallest change in his breathing. The gray shadows along his collarbone faded a little more with each passing hour, and by the second morning, his skin had returned almost entirely to its natural color, save for a faint discoloration near his heart that refused to disappear no matter what salves she applied. She did not mention this to anyone, not yet. Some instinct told her that whatever remained inside him was not finished, and until she understood it fully, spreading panic through the pack would only make things worse. Gareth had been thorough in his investigation, questioning every warrior who had been on patrol that night, examining the eastern wall inch by inch for signs of an intruder, checking every barrel and jar in the pack's food stores for tampering. He found nothing. No broken locks, no strange footprints, no missing guards who might have let someone through unnoticed. Whoever had poisoned Damien had done it with the kind of precision that suggested intimate knowledge of the pack's routines, which meant the most disturbing possibility of all. The poisoner was not an outsider. The poisoner belonged here. "I have a list," Gareth said quietly, setting a folded piece of parchment on the small table beside Damien's bed, on the morning of the third day. Elena looked up from where she had been changing the dressing, on a shallow scratch along Damien's forearm, one of the few visible marks left from that terrible night. Everyone who had access to the Eastern Patrol schedule, everyone who knew he would be walking that specific stretch of the border at that specific hour. Elena took the parchment and unfolded it slowly. 6 names were written in Gareth's neat, careful hand. She recognized every one of them: senior warriors, council members, people who had served the pack for years, some for decades, people who, by every measure Elena understood, had no reason to want their Alpha King dead. "Marcus is on this list," she said quietly, her eyes catching on the third name down. Gareth's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. Marcus has served on Border Patrol for 6 years. He would have known the schedule better than most. Elena set the parchment down carefully, forcing her expression to remain neutral, though her mind raced. Marcus, the warrior from the neighboring pack who had begun courting her so openly these past weeks, who had shown her nothing but patience and kindness since Damien's rejection, who had never once pressured her, or made her feel like anything less than worthy of respect. It felt impossible that he could be capable of something this calculated, this cruel. But felt impossible was not the same as was impossible, and Elena had learned long ago, through years of tending wounds inflicted by people who should have known better, that kindness on the surface did not always run deep. "I do not believe it is him," she said carefully. "But I understand why his name is here. I am not accusing anyone yet," Gareth said. "I am simply narrowing the field. Whoever did this had detailed knowledge of pack movements, access to rare poisons, and the patience to prepare something this precise without anyone noticing the preparation. That narrows things considerably." A low groan from the bed pulled both their attention away from the list. Damien's eyes fluttered, then opened, and for one heart-stopping moment, Elena feared they would still be black, still consumed by whatever had nearly killed him. Instead, gold met her gaze, weary and confused but unmistakably his own. "Elena," he rasped, voice rough from days of disuse. His eyes moved around the unfamiliar ceiling, taking in the healing house, the herbs hanging from the rafters, the worried face of his beta, standing just beyond her shoulder. "What happened? Why am I here?" Elena set down the bandages she had been holding and moved closer, checking his pulse with practiced efficiency, even as she answered. "You were poisoned 2 nights ago, during your patrol along the eastern border. Do you remember anything before you collapsed?" Damien's brow furrowed, and Elena watched him search through fragmented memories, his jaw tightening with visible frustration, each time something slipped away from him. "I remember walking the border. I remember a scent, something I did not recognize, coming from the tree line. And then pain. More pain than I have ever felt in my life, like something was trying to claw its way out from beneath my skin." He paused, and something flickered across his face, uncertainty mixed with something that looked almost like embarrassment. "I remember your voice. I remember you telling me to look at you." "You were fighting to stay conscious," Elena said, keeping her tone carefully professional, refusing to acknowledge the other thing he had said to her that night, the words about regret that still sat heavy and unresolved between them. "It worked, mostly. Whatever the poison intended to do to you, I do not believe it succeeded completely." Damien pushed himself up against the pillows, wincing at the effort, and Elena moved automatically to help brace his shoulders, her hands steady despite the sudden proximity, despite the way his scent, familiar even after 3 months apart, sent an unwelcome flutter through her chest. She stepped back the moment he was settled, putting professional distance between them, before either of them could dwell on it. "How long was I unconscious?" Damien asked. 2 days, Gareth answered, stepping forward now that his alpha was lucid enough to receive a full report. "We have kept the pack calm, by telling them you were recovering from a training injury. But that story will not hold much longer. People saw what happened that night. Rumors are already spreading. Damien's expression hardened, the exhaustion in his eyes giving way to something colder, more calculating, the look of a leader assessing a threat rather than a man recovering from near death. Tell me everything, every detail, no matter how small. Gareth recounted the investigation methodically, the black veining, the strange residue found in the soil, the list of 6 names with access to the patrol schedule, the lack of any physical evidence pointing to an outside intruder. Damien listened without interrupting, his jaw tightening progressively as the picture assembled itself into something deeply unsettling. Someone within these walls wants me dead, he said finally, voice flat, stripped of emotion in the way Elena remembered from before, the way he had sounded the night he rejected her, as though naming a painful truth required stripping away everything soft first. Someone with detailed knowledge of my movements, access to rare poisons, and enough patience to plan an attack this precise. That is the assessment, yes, Gareth confirmed. Then we find them, Damien said, attempting to swing his legs off the bed, only for Elena to step forward and press a firm hand against his chest, halting him before he could rise. You will do no such thing, she said, and there was steel in her voice now, the same steel that had kept the healing house running efficiently through 2 days of crisis. You were poisoned with something unlike anything I have ever encountered. There is still discoloration near your heart that I cannot explain, and your body needs time to fully recover before you go marching around the compound, interrogating suspects. Damien's eyes flashed, the old authority flaring even through his weakened state. I am the Alpha King. I do not take orders in my own healing house. You do when I am the one keeping you alive, Elena shot back, unflinching, despite the sudden intensity in his gaze. The way the air between them seemed to crackle with old tension, neither of them had fully released. You can be Alpha King, the moment your heart stops racing, every time you sit up too quickly. Until then, you are my patient, and my patient stays in this bed. For a long moment, neither of them moved, gold eyes locked with brown, in a silent standoff that had nothing to do with poison or investigations, and everything to do with 3 months of unspoken history sitting heavy between them. Gareth, wisely, said nothing, though Elena caught the faint twitch at the corner of his mouth that suggested he was fighting back a smile at his alpha being so thoroughly overruled. Finally, Damien exhaled, some of the tension leaving his shoulders, and sank back against the pillows with visible reluctance. Fine, but I want updates. Every development, every name that gets crossed off that list, every scrap of evidence Gareth uncovers, I will not lie in this bed blind to what is happening in my own pack. That I can agree to, Elena said, relief loosening something tight in her own chest, though she was careful not to let it show on her face. Over the following days, a fragile routine established itself. Damien's strength returned gradually, the discoloration near his heart shrinking bit by bit under Elena's careful treatments, though it never fully vanished, a permanent shadow that worried her more than she let on. Gareth continued his investigation, quietly questioning the 6 names on his list, ruling out 2 warriors who had solid alibis for the hours in question, narrowing the field further, without revealing to anyone why he was asking. Marcus visited the healing house on the 4th day, ostensibly to check on the Alpha's recovery, though Elena suspected the timing was not entirely coincidental. He brought a small bundle of rare healing herbs, gathered, he explained, from the eastern hills where he had grown up, herbs he thought might help speed the recovery process. That is thoughtful of you, Elena said, accepting the bundle and examining the contents with professional interest. Some of the herbs were unfamiliar to her, and she made a mental note to research them carefully before administering anything to Damien. I was concerned when I heard what happened, Marcus said, his eyes flicking briefly toward the bed where Damien lay watching the exchange, with an expression Elena could not quite read. An attack this brazen, this close to the heart of the pack, it troubles all of us. It should, Damien said, his voice carrying just enough edge to draw Marcus's full attention. Tell me, Marcus, where were you 2 nights ago, during the hours before midnight? Marcus's expression flickered, surprise giving way quickly to understanding, and something that might have been offense, though he masked it well. You suspect me. I suspect everyone with access to my patrol schedule, Damien said flatly. It is nothing personal. It is simply prudent. I was in the eastern barracks, playing cards with 3 other warriors until well past midnight, Marcus said, his tone carefully even, though Elena noticed the slight tightening around his eyes that suggested the question had genuinely stung. You may confirm it with any of them. I would never harm you, Alpha, whatever tension exists between us over matters unrelated to pack security. The unspoken reference to Elena hung heavy in the room for a moment, and Elena felt her cheeks warm, despite her best efforts to remain professionally detached. Damien's jaw tightened, but he said nothing further, simply nodding once in acknowledgement, before waving a hand to dismiss the topic entirely. Gareth will confirm your account, Damien said. Thank you for the herbs. Marcus left shortly after, and once the door closed behind him, Elena busied herself with reorganizing her supply shelves, avoiding Damien's gaze, uncomfortably aware of the way his eyes had followed Marcus's departure, with something sharp and assessing that had nothing to do with poison investigations at all. You do not need to interrogate every man who shows me kindness, she said finally, unable to help herself. I am not interrogating out of jealousy, Damien said, though something in his tone suggested otherwise. I am interrogating because someone in this pack wants me dead, and I would be a poor alpha if I ignored a suspect simply because his intentions toward you complicate the situation. Elena turned to face him fully, arms crossed, unwilling to let the moment pass without addressing it directly. You rejected me, Damien. In front of the entire pack, you do not get to interrogate the men who choose to treat me with respect afterward. Something raw flickered across his face, there and gone so quickly she almost missed it. I know what I did. Then act like it. Then act like it, Elena said, quieter now, though the steel remained. Focus on finding whoever poisoned you. Leave Marcus, and my personal life, out of it. She turned back to her shelves before he could respond, and though she felt his gaze on her back for a long moment afterward, he said nothing more, the silence between them heavy with everything neither of them was willing to say aloud. That night, after the healing house had gone quiet and Damien had finally drifted into genuine sleep rather than the fitful, poison-induced unconsciousness of the past days, Elena sat alone at her small desk, examining the herbs Marcus had brought under lamplight. Most were familiar, common remedies for fatigue and minor wounds. But tucked near the bottom of the bundle, she found a single sprig of something she did not recognize at all. Its leaves, an unusual dark purple, its stem faintly warm to the touch even hours after being cut. She set it aside carefully, a knot of unease tightening in her stomach, and made a note to research it thoroughly before she allowed it anywhere near Damien's recovering body. Trust, she was learning, was a luxury the pack could no longer afford, not with an unseen enemy still moving somewhere among them, patient and precise, waiting for the next opportunity to strike. The unfamiliar purple sprig sat in a small glass vial on Elena's desk for 3 days before she found an answer. She spent every spare hour cross-referencing it against every healing text the pack possessed, and when the pack's own library yielded nothing, she sent a request to a healer she had trained under years ago, now living 2 territories away, describing the plant in careful detail and asking if she recognized it. The response came back on the morning of the 4th day, carried by a tired messenger hawk that Elena fed and watered before even breaking the seal on the letter. She read it standing in the doorway of the healing house, and by the time she finished, her hands had gone cold. Nightbloom thorn, a plant so rare it grew in only a handful of locations across the continent, always in soil poisoned by old battles, old deaths, ground where violence had soaked so deep that ordinary plants refused to take root. Wolves who consumed even a small amount experienced heightened aggression, accelerated healing, and, in high enough doses, complete loss of rational control, the wolf spirit overtaking the human mind entirely, and never fully releasing it again. Her old mentor's letter ended with a stark warning. Whoever possesses Nightbloom thorn in significant quantity does not gather it by accident. It must be sought out, cultivated with immense patience, and administered with exact precision to avoid killing the subject outright before the transformation completes. This was not simply the poison that had nearly killed Damien. This was the same family of substance, or something closely related to it, delivered in a form disguised as harmless healing herbs and brought directly into the healing house by Marcus's own hand. Elena's first instinct was disbelief. Marcus had shown her nothing but consideration these past months, had never once pressured her, had seemed genuinely troubled by the attack on his alpha. But instinct was not evidence, and evidence, however circumstantial, was mounting against him with troubling consistency. She found Gareth in the training yard, overseeing a group of younger warriors, and pulled him aside the moment she caught his eye. "I need to speak with you, privately." They walked to the edge of the yard, away from listening ears, and Elena laid out everything: the unfamiliar herb hidden among Marcus's gift, the letter from her mentor, the terrifying possibility that Nightbloom thorn and the poison used against Damien might be one and the same, or close cousins built from the same dangerous knowledge. Gareth's expression darkened with every word. "You believe Marcus poisoned him, then attempted to finish the job by disguising more of the same substance as a healing gift." "I do not want to believe it," Elena said honestly, "but I cannot ignore what the evidence suggests. His alibi for the night of the attack has not yet been fully confirmed, has it?" "I spoke with 2 of the 3 warriors he claimed to be playing cards with," Gareth admitted slowly. "Both confirmed his presence, but only for part of the evening. There is a gap of nearly 2 hours where his whereabouts are unaccounted for." Elena's stomach twisted. 2 hours would have been more than enough time to slip away, deliver the poison, and return before anyone noticed his absence. "We need to speak with Damien," she said. They found him in his private study, poring over pack ledgers with the restless energy of a man who had spent too many days confined to a sickbed and was determined to prove himself fully recovered. He looked up the moment they entered, reading the tension in both their faces immediately. "What happened?" Elena explained everything again, watching Damien's expression shift from careful attention to cold fury as the pieces assembled themselves before him. By the time she finished, his hands had curled into fists atop the ledger, knuckles white with restrained tension. "Bring him to me," Damien said, voice low and dangerous, in a way Elena had never heard, directed at anyone but the pack's true enemies. "Now." "Wait," Elena said quickly, stepping forward before Gareth could move to obey. "If we confront him directly, and he is innocent, we damage a relationship with a neighboring pack over circumstantial evidence. If we confront him, and he is guilty, we lose the element of surprise, and he may have accomplices still hidden among us who will simply try again through someone else. We need more than suspicion before we act." Damien's jaw tightened, every instinct in him clearly screaming to act immediately, to protect his pack the only way he knew how, through direct and decisive force. But he forced himself to still, drawing a slow breath, and Elena watched him visibly choose control over instinct, the same restraint she remembered admiring in him long before everything between them had fallen apart. "What do you suggest instead?" he asked finally. "Surveillance," Gareth offered. "Quiet observation. If Marcus is responsible, he will not stop with one attempt, especially not now that his first effort failed. If we watch him carefully, without alerting him to our suspicion, he may lead us directly to whatever accomplices or resources he is using." Damien considered this for a long moment, before nodding sharply. "Fine. But I want him watched at all times. Every movement, every conversation, every visit to the training grounds or the border. I will not lose another moment of ignorance, while he moves freely among my people." The surveillance began that same evening, conducted with careful discretion by warriors Gareth trusted absolutely. Elena continued her normal duties, tending to the pack's usual injuries and illnesses, all while quietly documenting everything she learned about Nightbloom thorn, searching for any method that might counteract its effects fully, should Damien ever be exposed again. 3 days into the surveillance, one of Gareth's most trusted warriors reported something troubling. Marcus had been seen leaving the pack's territory late at night, traveling alone toward the eastern forest, the same direction from which the strange scent had come the night Damien was poisoned. He remained gone for nearly 3 hours before returning, moving with the careful, quiet steps of someone who did not wish to be noticed. "Follow him next time," Damien ordered, the moment he received the report, restraint fraying visibly now despite his best efforts. "I want to know exactly where he goes, and who he meets." The opportunity came 2 nights later. Marcus slipped away from the barracks just past midnight, and this time, 2 of Gareth's warriors trailed him at a careful distance, staying downwind, moving through the shadows of the tree line with practiced silence. They returned before dawn, with a report that sent ice through Elena's veins the moment she heard it. Marcus had met with a stranger deep in the eastern forest, a man neither warrior recognized, wrapped in a dark traveling cloak that obscured most of his features. The two had exchanged a small pouch, and though the warriors had not been close enough to hear every word, they had caught fragments of conversation that left little room for innocent interpretation. Words like dosage and timing, and the second attempt must not fail this time. Elena felt sick hearing it recounted. She had liked Marcus, had allowed herself to believe his kindness was genuine, had even begun to wonder, in quiet, unguarded moments, whether a future with him might be possible, after everything with Damien had fallen apart. Learning that his gentleness might have been nothing more than careful performance, a mask worn to gain access close enough to strike, felt like a betrayal layered on top of an already painful year. Damien's fury, when he received the report, was a controlled and terrible thing. He did not shout. He did not shift or lose himself to rage the way Elena might have expected. Instead, his voice went perfectly flat and calm, more frightening for its stillness than any outburst could have been. "Bring him to me, tonight. I want him in chains before the entire council by morning." This time, Elena did not argue. The evidence had moved beyond circumstantial suspicion into something approaching certainty, and every additional hour of delay was another hour Marcus might use to complete whatever the stranger in the forest had provided him. Gareth assembled a team of 6 warriors, moving with quiet efficiency through the pack grounds toward the barracks where Marcus slept. Elena followed at a careful distance, unable to stay away despite knowing her presence was not strictly necessary, some part of her needing to see this through to its end with her own eyes. They found Marcus's quarters empty. His bed had not been slept in. His few personal belongings remained, scattered in a way that suggested a hasty departure rather than careful packing, as though he had left in a hurry, perhaps sensing the surveillance closing in around him despite the warrior's careful discretion. "He knows," Gareth said grimly, surveying the empty room. "Somehow, he knows we are on to him." Damien arrived moments later, having been alerted the instant the empty quarters were discovered, and his expression upon seeing the abandoned room was murderous in its restrained intensity. "Search every inch of this territory." He cannot have gone far, not on foot, not without alerting the border sentries. The search stretched through the remaining hours of darkness, and into the gray light of early morning, warriors combing every stretch of forest, every hidden path, every possible route Marcus might have used to slip away undetected. They found nothing. No trace of him remained beyond the empty quarters, and a single set of footprints leading toward the eastern forest, before vanishing entirely at the tree line, as though he had simply dissolved into the darkness. Elena stood at the edge of the search area as dawn broke fully over the horizon, exhaustion and unease warring inside her chest. Marcus had vanished, but his accomplice, the stranger in the dark cloak, remained entirely unidentified, still out there somewhere, still in possession of whatever poison or plan they had been refining together. Damien approached her quietly as the search parties began returning empty-handed. His expression softened slightly now that the immediate fury had burned down into something more contemplative, more tired. "You suspected him before I did," he said. "You found the evidence that started all of this." "I did not want to be right," Elena admitted. "I liked him, Damien. I believed his kindness was real." "Perhaps it was," Damien said quietly, surprising her. "Perhaps a person can be genuinely kind in some moments and genuinely dangerous in others. It does not make the danger any less real, but it does not necessarily make the kindness a lie either." Elena looked up at him, startled by the unexpected gentleness in his observation, so different from the cold, decisive alpha who had spent the past hour organizing search parties with ruthless efficiency. For a moment, something passed between them that had nothing to do with poison or betrayal, something older and more fragile, the ghost of whatever they might have built together before everything fell apart. "We should return to the healing house," Elena said finally, breaking the moment before it could deepen into something neither of them was prepared to address. "You should not be standing out here in the cold this long, after everything your body has been through." Damien did not argue, though she noticed the way his eyes lingered on her a moment longer than necessary, before he finally turned to follow her back toward the compound, leaving Gareth and the remaining warriors to continue the fruitless search for their vanished suspect. Whatever kindness Marcus had shown her, real or performed, one truth remained unshaken as the sun rose fully over the packlands that morning. Somewhere out there, hidden in shadow, a man who had tried to poison the Alpha King remained free, along with an unknown accomplice possessing knowledge dangerous enough to nearly destroy the strongest wolf in 3 territories. The threat had not ended, it had only gone quiet, coiling itself back into darkness, waiting patiently for its next opportunity to strike. A full week passed without any sign of Marcus or the mysterious stranger from the forest. The pack settled into a tense, watchful quiet, warriors doubling their patrols along every border, sentries posted in shifts through every hour of the night. Damien returned to his duties gradually, though Elena insisted on daily examinations, tracking the stubborn shadow near his heart that refused to fully fade despite every treatment she attempted. It was during one of these examinations, in the quiet privacy of the healing house before the rest of the pack had risen for the day, that Damien finally spoke about something Elena had wondered about for months but never dared to ask. "You want to know why I rejected you?" he said, breaking the comfortable silence as she pressed gentle fingers against his chest, checking the discoloration beneath his skin. It was not a question. Elena's hands stilled for a moment before she continued her examination, keeping her voice carefully neutral. "You do not owe me an explanation, Damien. What is done is done." "I owe you more than an explanation," he said, and something in his tone made her look up, meeting eyes that held none of the coldness she remembered from that terrible night beneath the full moon. "I owe you the truth, whether or not it changes anything between us now." Elena set down her instrument slowly, giving him her full attention, some part of her that she had tried desperately to silence over these past months, leaning forward, eager, despite herself, to finally understand. "My mother was a rejected mate," Damien began, his voice quieter than Elena had ever heard it, stripped of the authority he usually wore like armor. "Not rejected by my father, but rejected by the bond itself, a rare and cruel thing that happens sometimes when the pull between 2 wolves proves too weak to sustain a true mating. She loved my father desperately, completely, and the bond simply was not strong enough to hold. She spent the rest of her life chasing a connection that had already slipped through her fingers, watching him grow distant, watching him eventually take a second mate, while she remained bound to a title and a duty that gave her nothing in return." Elena remained silent, sensing he needed to finish without interruption, though her chest ached at the grief still evident in his voice, even after what must have been years of carrying this story alone. "She died believing she had failed as a mate, as a mother, as everything she had once hoped to be," Damien continued. "I watched that slow destruction for my entire childhood. I watched a bond that should have been a gift become a cage that trapped her in misery for decades. When I felt the pull toward you that night beneath the moon, stronger than anything I had ever experienced, I panicked. I convinced myself that a bond so intense could only end the same way my parents had, in slow devastation, in one person loving desperately, while the other grew cold and distant. I told myself that rejecting you before either of us grew too attached would spare us both that same fate. So you rejected me to protect me," Elena said slowly, working through the logic even as something in her chest twisted painfully at the confession. "Or to protect yourself." "Both, I think," Damien admitted, "though I have had 3 months to recognize how foolish that reasoning truly was. I mistook the intensity of what I felt for you as proof it could not last, when in truth, it was proof of exactly the opposite. My parents' bond failed because the pull between them was too weak, not too strong. What I felt for you that night, what I still feel every single day since, has never once wavered, not even when I convinced myself I was doing the right thing by pushing you away." Elena's breath caught, her carefully maintained composure threatening to crack, for the first time since that night on the ceremonial grounds, when she had refused to beg, refused to cry, refused to give anyone the satisfaction of watching her fall apart. "You do not get to say things like that to me," she said, though her voice lacked the conviction she wanted it to carry. "Not after everything. You cannot simply explain your reasoning and expect 3 months of pain to disappear because you finally understand your own mistake." "I do not expect that," Damien said quickly, sitting forward despite the ache Elena knew still lingered in his healing body. "I know I have no right to expect anything from you at all. I only wanted you to understand why I did what I did, even knowing it does not excuse the pain it caused you. You deserved better than watching me destroy something precious, out of fear I never even gave you the chance to help me work through." Elena stood abruptly, needing distance to think clearly, needing space from the raw honesty in his eyes that threatened to undo 3 months of carefully rebuilt walls. She crossed to the window, staring out at the pack grounds bathed in early morning light. Warriors already moving through their patrol routines, the ordinary rhythm of life continuing, despite everything that had nearly been lost. "I accepted your rejection without begging," she said quietly, not turning to face him. "Do you know why?" "I have wondered every day since," Damien admitted. "Because begging would have meant asking you to want something you had already decided you did not want," Elena said, her voice steady, despite the emotion tightening her throat. "I refuse to spend the rest of my life wondering whether you stayed with me, out of obligation or genuine desire. I would rather have my dignity and your absence than your presence, built on pity for my tears." "It was never pity you would have earned," Damien said quietly. "It was never that, Elena. Not for one single moment." She turned to face him then, and found his gold eyes fixed on her with an intensity that stole the breath from her lungs, none of the coldness from that terrible night remaining, replaced instead by something raw and unguarded that she had never once seen him allow himself to show, not even in the private moments they had shared before everything fell apart. "I cannot simply forget what happened," she said finally. "I will not pretend 3 months of pain vanish, because you have finally found the words to explain your fear." "I am not asking you to forget," Damien said. "I am asking for the chance to earn something I threw away out of foolishness. Nothing more than that. However long it takes, whatever proof you need. I intend to spend it proving that what I feel for you was never weak, and never temporary, no matter how badly I mishandled it that night." Before Elena could formulate a response, the healing house door burst open, and one of Gareth's warriors stumbled inside, breathless and pale, interrupting the moment, with news that drained every trace of softness from Damien's expression in an instant. "Alpha, you need to come now! We found him! We found Marcus!" Elena's heart lurched. "Alive?" The warrior hesitated, exchanging a brief, uncomfortable glance with Damien before answering. "Barely. He is at the northern border, and Alpha, he is asking for Elena specifically. He says he has information about the accomplice, but he will only speak with her present." Damien was already moving, pulling on his boots despite Elena's automatic protest about his continued need for rest, and within minutes, the three of them were riding hard toward the northern border, Elena's healing satchel bouncing against her hip, dread coiling tight in her stomach with every passing mile. Whatever Marcus had to say, whatever truth had driven him to vanish for a week only to resurface now, broken, and specifically requesting her presence, Elena suspected it would change everything they thought they understood about the danger still stalking their pack. The ride felt endless, though it could not have taken more than 20 minutes to reach the northern border, where a small group of warriors had gathered around a figure slumped against the base of an old oak tree. Even from a distance, Elena could see the extent of his condition, clothes torn and bloodied, one arm held awkwardly against his chest in a way that suggested serious injury, his face pale and gaunt in a manner that spoke of days without proper food or rest. She dismounted before her horse had fully stopped, satchel already open in her hands as she rushed toward him, years of training overriding every complicated emotion she felt about the man who might have poisoned the Alpha King she still, despite everything, could not stop loving. Marcus's eyes fluttered open as she knelt beside him, focusing with visible effort on her face. "Elena," he rasped, voice barely audible. "You came." "Save your strength," she said automatically, already assessing the extent of his injuries, checking his pulse, examining the wound along his ribs that looked suspiciously like a claw mark from another wolf, not the kind of injury one sustained from simple travel through rough terrain. "Someone did this to you." "He did," Marcus whispered, and his eyes flicked briefly toward Damien, who had dismounted, and now stood a short distance away, tension radiating from every line of his body, as he watched the exchange with barely restrained impatience. "The man I met in the forest. He was never my ally, Elena. He forced my cooperation from the very beginning." Elena's hands stilled against his wound. "What do you mean, forced?" "He threatened my sister," Marcus said, each word costing him visible effort, pain and exhaustion making his voice fade in and out. "She lives 2 territories east, unprotected, and he knew exactly where to find her. He came to me months ago, before Damien ever rejected you, told me he needed help, gaining trust close to the Alpha King, said he only wanted to weaken him temporarily, not kill him. I believed I had no choice but to comply, and I told myself the poison would only cause temporary illness, not the horror I witnessed that night. Damien's jaw tightened, though he said nothing, allowing the confession to continue uninterrupted. When I realized what the poison had actually done to him, when I saw what it nearly turned him into, I refused to continue. Marcus continued, breath growing shallower. I tried to warn you, tried to find a way to expose him without endangering my sister, but he discovered my hesitation. He hunted me through the forest for days, and I only just managed to escape, though I fear it is not truly over. He will not stop until his plan succeeds, whatever that plan truly is. Who is he? Damien demanded, finally stepping forward, voice tight with barely restrained urgency. Give me a name. Marcus's eyes fluttered closed, consciousness slipping away from him rapidly now, and Elena worked frantically to stabilize his breathing, even as she strained to hear his fading whisper. He called himself Alaric, Marcus breathed, the name barely audible, before his eyes rolled back, and his body went limp against the tree trunk, unconsciousness claiming him fully. Elena's hands moved with practiced urgency, checking his pulse, confirming he had merely lost consciousness, rather than succumbed to his injuries, while behind her, she heard Damien repeat the unfamiliar name under his breath, filing it away with the cold, calculating focus of a leader, already planning his next move against an enemy, who finally, after weeks of shadow and uncertainty, had a name. Marcus survived the night, though it took 3 days of careful treatment before he grew strong enough to answer further questions. Elena tended his wounds herself, unable to fully separate her lingering anger at his involvement from the genuine sympathy she felt upon learning the extent of the coercion that had trapped him. He had made a terrible choice, but he had made it out of desperation to protect someone he loved, and Elena understood that particular kind of fear better than most. Damien, for his part, showed remarkable restraint in his dealings with the recovering warrior, though Elena suspected it cost him considerable effort. He questioned Marcus thoroughly once the man regained enough strength to speak clearly, extracting every detail he could remember about Alaric, his appearance, his manner of speech, any clue about where he might be hiding, or what territory he originally hailed from. The details, unfortunately, painted a frustratingly incomplete picture. Alaric had kept his hood raised during every meeting, revealing only a portion of his face, pale skin marked by an old scar running from his left temple down to his jaw. His voice carried an accent Marcus could not quite place, something clipped and precise, that suggested education, rather than the rougher speech of common mercenaries. He had known extraordinary amounts about pack politics, about Damien's routines, about the exact composition of poisons capable of overwhelming even an alpha's formidable constitution. This was not a random attack, Damien said grimly, pacing the length of his study as Gareth and Elena listened. The three of them gathered to review everything Marcus's testimony had revealed. Whoever Alaric is, he has studied this pack extensively, likely for months if not years, before making his move. Which raises the obvious question, Gareth said. Why now? What changed recently that made this the moment he decided to strike? Elena felt the weight of both men's attention shift toward her, before either spoke the answer aloud, and she understood immediately what they were both thinking. The rejection, she said quietly. Damien's rejection of me happened 3 months ago. If Alaric has been watching this pack for a long time, he would have witnessed that moment, and everything that followed. A pack in emotional turmoil is a pack with weakened cohesion, Gareth said slowly, working through the logic. An alpha distracted by personal regret, warriors uncertain about succession and stability, the entire structure more vulnerable than it would be under ordinary circumstances. He waited for a moment of weakness, Damien said, his voice tight with something between fury and self-recrimination. My own foolishness may have handed him the perfect opportunity. You cannot blame yourself for another man's cruelty, Elena said firmly, though her chest ached at watching him spiral into guilt that served no productive purpose. Whatever Alaric's motivations, whatever timing he chose, the fault lies with him and him alone. Damien's eyes met hers across the room, gratitude and lingering guilt warring in his expression, but he said nothing further on the matter, turning instead back toward the practical question of what to do next. We need to identify him, he said. A scar like the one Marcus described should be recognizable. If we can get word to allied packs and trading routes throughout the region, someone, somewhere, will have encountered him before. Gareth nodded, already making notes. I will send messengers to every allied territory within a week's travel. If Alaric has operated elsewhere before targeting us, someone may recognize the description. The messengers departed within days, carrying detailed descriptions to packs across the region, and the following 2 weeks passed in a strange, uneasy calm. No further attacks occurred. No sign of Alaric surfaced anywhere along the borders. Marcus recovered enough to walk unaided, though he remained under careful watch, his sister brought to the safety of the pack's territory, under Damien's personal protection, once her location had been confirmed secure. Elena found herself spending more time with Damien during this quiet period than she had allowed herself since the rejection, their conversations no longer confined strictly to matters of his physical recovery. They talked about small things, the kind of ordinary conversations that had once formed the foundation of whatever connection had drawn them together in the first place, before fear and misunderstanding tore it apart. He asked about her training as a healer, about the family she had lost young, and the mentor who had raised her in their place. She asked about his own childhood, about the burdens of leadership thrust upon him too early after his mother's death, about the loneliness he had carried, long before she ever entered his life. Neither of them spoke directly about the future, about whether the bond between them, wounded but seemingly not fully severed, could ever be rebuilt into something whole again. But the careful distance Elena had maintained since the rejection began, slowly, and almost imperceptibly, to soften, replaced by something that felt dangerously close to hope. It was during one of these quiet evenings, sharing a simple meal in the healing house after most of the pack had retired for the night, that the fragile peace shattered entirely. A warrior burst through the door, face ashen, breathless from running. Alpha, the northern watchtower. It has gone silent. No response to the signal horn, no movement visible from the ground. Damien was on his feet instantly, all traces of the softer man from moments before vanishing beneath the sharp focus of a leader, responding to threat. How many warriors were posted there? 4 Alpha. Assemble a response team, now. Damien's voice carried across the healing house, with the authority Elena remembered from before everything fell apart, commanding and absolute, and despite the fear coiling tight in her stomach, she felt a fierce swell, of something like pride, watching him move into action. I am coming with you, she said, already gathering her satchel. Elena. 4 warriors may be injured. She cut him off firmly, meeting his gaze without flinching. You need a healer present, and I refuse to sit here waiting for news when I could be helping. This is not a discussion, Damien. He held her gaze a moment longer before nodding sharply, some complicated mixture of frustration and reluctant respect crossing his features. Stay close to Gareth at all times. If anything happens, if I give the order to retreat, you retreat immediately. No arguments. Elena nodded, and within minutes the response team was mounted and riding hard through the darkness toward the northern watchtower, torches casting flickering light across the forest path as they moved. The tower came into view eventually, silhouetted against the star-filled sky, and even from a distance, the wrongness of the scene was immediately apparent. No torchlight glowed from the platform above. No movement stirred along the base where sentries should have been standing watch. Damien raised a hand, signaling the group to slow their approach, and the warriors fanned out with practiced discipline, weapons drawn, senses straining for any sign of danger in the surrounding darkness. They found the first warrior at the base of the tower, unconscious but breathing, a shallow wound along his temple, suggesting he had been struck down rather than attacked with lethal intent. Elena moved to his side immediately, checking his pulse and beginning treatment, even as the rest of the group continued searching. The second and third warriors were found in similar condition, unconscious but alive, scattered near the tower's base, as though they had been dealt with quickly and efficiently by someone who valued speed over cruelty. The fourth warrior was nowhere to be found. He took one of them, Gareth said grimly, surveying the scene with a torch held high. Why would he leave 3 unconscious and take only the 4th? Damien's expression had gone deadly calm. The particular stillness Elena had learned to recognize as far more dangerous than any outburst of visible rage. Because he wants something from that warrior specifically. Information, perhaps, or leverage. Who was posted here tonight? Elena asked, moving to check on the third unconscious warrior, while keeping half her attention on the conversation. Gareth's face went pale as realization struck him. Alpha, the fourth warrior tonight, was Tobias, your cousin. The words landed like a physical blow, and Elena watched something shift behind Damien's eyes. Fury and fear, intertwining, into something almost unrecognizable. Family. Alaric had not simply attacked the pack's borders tonight. He had taken someone who shared Damien's own blood, someone whose loss would strike at the Alpha King with a precision that no random assault could ever achieve. He is sending a message, Damien said, voice tight with barely contained rage. He wants me to understand exactly how close he can reach, and exactly how much he is willing to take from me if I do not comply with whatever he intends to demand. As if summoned by the words themselves, a low horn sounded from somewhere deep within the forest beyond the tower. 3 long notes that echoed eerily through the darkness, before fading into silence. Every warrior present tensed, weapons raised, eyes straining toward the tree line where the sound had originated. A folded piece of parchment fluttered down from above, caught by a gust of wind, landing at Damien's feet. He snatched it up immediately, unfolding it with barely restrained fury, and Elena watched his face harden into something carved from stone, as he read whatever message had been left for him. "What does it say?" Gareth asked, when Damien remained silent too long. Damien's hand trembled slightly, the parchment crinkling under the tension of his grip, before he finally spoke, his voice low and dangerous, in a way that promised violence to whoever had dared threaten his family. "He wants me to come alone to the eastern ruins by dawn. If I bring anyone with me, if I alert the Pack Council, if I do anything but comply exactly as instructed, he says Tobias dies before the sun fully rises." Elena's heart lurched, dread pooling cold in her stomach. "You cannot go alone. That is exactly what he wants, to separate you from any protection, to finish what he started weeks ago." "I know that," Damien said, folding the parchment carefully, his eyes fixed on the dark tree line, as though he could will his enemy into visibility through sheer force of determination. "But I also know what it means to lose family to violence I could have prevented. I will not let Tobias pay for whatever mistake put me on this man's list." The night stretched ahead of them, heavy with uncertainty and dread, and as the response team began the grim work of tending to the injured warriors and preparing for whatever confrontation dawn would bring, Elena found herself standing beside Damien in tense silence, both of them staring toward the same dark horizon, where an enemy neither of them fully understood waited with patient, terrible purpose. Damien gathered the Pack Council within the hour, despite the note's explicit warning against alerting anyone. Elena understood his reasoning, even as her heart pounded with fear for what the next few hours might bring. Going in blind, without any plan beyond blind obedience to a kidnapper's demands, would only guarantee failure. If Tobias was to have any real chance of survival, Damien needed allies who understood the stakes, even if the final approach to the ruins had to be made alone. He said come alone, Gareth reminded him grimly, as the council assembled in the war room, torches casting long shadows across the stone walls. "If he sees warriors positioned nearby, he may kill Tobias regardless of your compliance." "I am aware of the risk," Damien said, his voice steady, despite the tension radiating from every line of his body. "Which is why no warrior will be visible. I need archers positioned in the ruins themselves, hidden among the old stonework, close enough to act the moment an opportunity presents itself, far enough that Alaric will not detect them through scent or sight before I arrive." Elena studied the map spread across the table, the eastern ruins marked in faded ink, remnants of a settlement abandoned generations ago, its crumbling walls and half-collapsed towers providing ample cover for anyone skilled enough to remain hidden. The wind typically blows from the east through those ruins in early morning. If your archers position themselves on the western edge, their scent will carry away from the approach, not toward it. Gareth glanced at her with something like surprise. "You know the terrain?" "I gathered herbs there as a girl," Elena said simply. "The ruins hold rare plants that grow nowhere else in this territory. I know every collapsed wall and hidden alcove within those grounds." Damien's eyes met hers, something sharpening in his expression as an idea began to form. "Then you will guide the archers into position before dawn. Your knowledge of that terrain may be the difference between a hidden position and a fatal mistake." "Absolutely not," Gareth interjected immediately. Alpha, sending Elena into potential danger is necessary, Elena finished firmly, cutting off his protest before it could gain momentum. I know that ground better than anyone else in this room. I am not asking permission, Gareth. I am telling you what needs to happen for this plan to succeed. The council debated logistics for the better part of an hour, mapping out positions, assigning roles, calculating timing with the kind of meticulous precision that came from warriors who had spent years planning for moments exactly like this one. By the time the meeting concluded, a plan had taken shape. 6 of Gareth's most skilled archers would position themselves among the ruins before first light, guided into place by Elena's knowledge of the terrain. Damien would approach alone as instructed, giving Alaric no visible reason for suspicion, while the hidden warriors waited for any opportunity to strike without endangering Tobias further. It was not a perfect plan. Too many variables remained unknown. Too many assumptions about Alaric's behavior and intentions left room for catastrophic error. But it was the best option available given the brutal constraints of time, and as the pale gray light of pre-dawn began creeping across the horizon, the group moved out toward the eastern ruins, with grim, silent determination. Elena led the archers through the forest with careful precision, memory guiding her steps along paths she had not walked in years, past the collapsed remains of an old well, through a gap in a crumbling wall too narrow for anyone unfamiliar with its exact location to notice in the dim light. She positioned each archer with quiet efficiency, checking sight lines, confirming the wind carried away from the central courtyard, where Damien would presumably meet with Alaric, ensuring every hidden warrior had a clear angle, without risk of detection. By the time the sky had lightened enough to reveal the outlines of the ancient stonework in full detail, the trap had been set. 6 skilled archers hidden among the ruins, weapons ready, breath held in anticipation of whatever the coming confrontation would bring. Elena remained with Gareth near the western edge, close enough to monitor the situation, far enough to remain concealed alongside the archers. Her satchel sat heavy against her hip, prepared for whatever injuries the morning might bring, though she prayed with every fiber of her being that it would not be needed for anything beyond minor precaution. Damien arrived at the eastern entrance of the ruins alone, exactly as instructed, his tall frame silhouetted against the brightening sky, every step deliberate and unhurried, despite the obvious tension coiled beneath his controlled exterior. Elena watched from her hidden position, heart hammering against her ribs, willing herself to remain silent and still, despite every instinct screaming at her to do something, anything, to protect the man walking alone into what could easily be a fatal trap. Minutes passed in agonizing silence. Then, from the shadows of a half-collapsed tower near the center of the ruins, a figure emerged. Elena caught her first clear glimpse of Alaric in the growing light, and understood immediately why Marcus's fragmented description had failed to fully capture the man's presence. He moved with unsettling grace, his dark cloak pushed back now to reveal features that were almost handsome in their sharp precision, marred only by the old scar running from temple to jaw exactly as Marcus had described. His eyes, even from this distance, carried a cold, calculating intelligence that made the hair on Elena's arms rise with instinctive unease. Beside him, bound and gagged but visibly alive, stood Tobias, held in place by a firm grip on his upper arm, his eyes wide with fear, but otherwise appearing unharmed beyond the visible strain of his bindings. "You came alone," Alaric said, his voice carrying easily across the ruins in the morning stillness, the accent Marcus had described lending his words a clipped, almost aristocratic edge. How refreshingly predictable. "I confess, I expected more resistance from the Alpha King I have studied so thoroughly these past months." "Release my cousin," Damien said, his voice carrying an authority that did not waver despite the obvious danger of his position. "You wanted me here. I have come. There is no need to prolong his suffering further." Alaric's lips curved into something that was not quite a smile. "Patience, Alpha. We have much to discuss before I consider releasing anyone." "Then discuss it," Damien said flatly. "What do you want from me?" "Your throne," Alaric said simply, and the words hung heavy in the morning air, stripped of any pretense or complication. "Or more precisely, I want you removed from it, permanently, so that a more suitable arrangement can be made for territories that have suffered under cross-pack dominance for far too long." "This is about territory disputes," Gareth muttered under his breath, low enough that only Elena could hear. You could have simply challenged me directly, Damien said, his voice carrying a note of genuine confusion beneath the wariness. Formal challenge for leadership is an accepted practice among our kind. Why the poison, the manipulation, the elaborate deception through Marcus? Because a formal challenge assumes I could defeat you in honest combat, Alaric said, something bitter flickering across his controlled features for the first time. And we both know that outcome would not favor me. Your strength is legendary throughout these territories, Alpha, undefeated in every honest confrontation you have faced. I required a different approach, something that would weaken you first, destabilize your pack's confidence in your leadership, create the perfect conditions for a takeover that required no honest fight at all. The night bloom thorn, Elena whispered to herself, understanding dawning cold and clear. He had not simply wanted Damien dead, he had wanted to transform him into something monstrous, something the pack itself would have been forced to reject or destroy, clearing the path for a new leader without ever risking direct confrontation. It failed, Damien said. I survived your poison. I remain Alpha King of this pack, and my people remain loyal to my leadership. For now, Alaric agreed, his grip tightening visibly on Tobias's arm, drawing a muffled sound of pain from the bound warrior. But loyalty is a fragile thing, Alpha, easily fractured by the right pressure applied in the right places. Your cousin's life, for instance, makes for remarkably effective leverage. Step down from your position. Name a successor of my choosing. Do this, and Tobias walks free, unharmed, and this entire unpleasant affair concludes without further bloodshed. And if I refuse? Damien asked, though Elena could hear the barely restrained fury beneath his controlled tone. Alaric's smile widened, cold and terrible. Then I demonstrate exactly how thoroughly I have studied this pack, and exactly how many more pressure points I have identified beyond a single cousin held captive in ancient ruins. As if the words themselves were a signal, movement stirred at the edges of the ruins, and Elena's blood ran cold as she realized what Alaric truly meant. Shadows detached themselves from the crumbling walls on every side, more figures emerging from concealment, at least a dozen armed strangers surrounding the central courtyard where Damien stood, effectively cutting off any hope of the hidden archers achieving a clean, decisive strike without triggering a far larger confrontation than anyone had anticipated. He knew, Gareth breathed beside Elena, horror dawning in his voice. He knew we would try to hide support nearby. This entire confrontation has been a trap within a trap. Elena's heart hammered against her ribs as she watched Damien, standing alone in the center of a courtyard, now surrounded by more than a dozen hostile strangers. His cousin held hostage before him, and realized with sickening clarity that whatever plan they had carefully constructed through the long hours before dawn had just been rendered catastrophically insufficient against an enemy who had anticipated every move they might make. Elena felt Gareth tense beside her, his hand instinctively moving toward the bow slung across his back, though his expression remained carefully controlled, calculating rather than panicked. Years of training as a warrior had taught him to assess even the most dire situations with clear eyes rather than surrendering to fear. Signal the archers to hold, he whispered urgently to the warrior positioned nearest him, who passed the message along the hidden line with a series of subtle hand gestures. If we strike now, we risk triggering all 12 of Alaric's men at once, and Damien stands directly in the crossfire. Elena's mind raced, searching for any option that might tip the balance in their favor. The dozen strangers surrounding the courtyard carried themselves like trained fighters, weapons drawn and ready, positioned with the kind of deliberate spacing that suggested coordinated planning, rather than hasty improvisation. Alaric had not simply anticipated the possibility of hidden support. He had planned an entire counter-ambush around that exact expectation, using Damien's own likely strategy against him. "You disappoint me, Alpha," Alaric said, his voice carrying easily across the tense silence of the courtyard, a note of theatrical satisfaction lacing his words as he observed Damien's carefully controlled expression. "Did you truly believe I would walk into this confrontation without accounting for the possibility of hidden warriors? I have watched your pack for months. I know how Gareth thinks. I know the tactical instincts that guide every decision your beta makes, and I planned accordingly." Damien's jaw tightened, though his voice remained remarkably steady when he responded. "Then release Tobias now, before this situation escalates beyond anyone's control. Whatever grievance you hold against my pack, harming an innocent warrior will not resolve it in your favor." Innocent is a matter of perspective, Alaric said coldly. Your pack has expanded its borders 3 times in the past decade, absorbing smaller territories that once stood independent, forcing weaker packs into subservience or exile. My own family lost everything when your father's expansion claimed our ancestral lands 2 generations ago. I have spent my entire life planning for this moment, Alpha, and I will not abandon it now, simply because your beta thought to hide a handful of archers among these ruins. The revelation struck Elena with unexpected force. This was not simple opportunism or random cruelty. This was decades of grievance, inherited and nurtured across generations, finally finding its violent expression in a carefully orchestrated plot against a man who had inherited his father's legacy, without ever choosing the conflicts that shaped it. My father's actions are not mine, Damien said, something almost sorrowful entering his voice, despite the danger surrounding him. If your family suffered injustice, I am prepared to discuss reparation, restoration of territory, whatever remedy might address genuine harm done. But not like this, not with my cousin's life used as a weapon against reasonable negotiation. For just a moment, something flickered across Alaric's controlled expression, a flash of uncertainty quickly suppressed beneath renewed resolve. It is far too late for negotiation, Alpha. I have committed too much, sacrificed too much. To abandon this plan now over words that may or may not prove sincere, once your position of safety is restored. Elena watched the exchange with growing desperation, understanding that Alaric's resolve, however wounded by generational grievance, remained fixed and unshakable. Words alone would not resolve this confrontation. Something else would need to shift the balance before violence erupted beyond anyone's ability to contain it. She glanced toward Gareth, an idea forming rapidly in her mind. Dangerous, but perhaps their only viable option given the deteriorating circumstances. The eastern tower, she whispered urgently. The one with the partial collapse near its base. I remember from childhood that its upper platform overlooks the entire courtyard, and the approach from behind is concealed by the old grain storage walls. If I could reach it unseen, I might create a distraction, significant enough to fracture Alaric's formation. Gareth's eyes widened with alarm. Absolutely not. You are not trained for this kind of confrontation, Elena. If I am discovered, I am a healer wandering ruins for herbs, exactly as I claimed my knowledge of this terrain came from. Elena countered swiftly. Alaric does not know my face. His men have no reason to suspect a lone woman moving through the outer ruins poses any threat at all. Before Gareth could formulate a further objection, Elena had already begun moving, low and quiet, circling wide around the concealed archer positions, toward the collapsed section of wall she remembered from her childhood explorations decades ago. Her heart pounded with a fear entirely separate from professional composure, every instinct warning her of the danger inherent in approaching an active hostage situation without proper training or protection. But watching Damien stand alone in that courtyard, surrounded by hostile strangers, his cousin's life hanging in precarious balance, she found herself moving forward regardless, propelled by something stronger than fear. She reached the base of the eastern tower within minutes, moving carefully through overgrown vegetation that had reclaimed much of the ancient structure over the decades since its abandonment. The climb proved more difficult than she remembered, weathered stone crumbling beneath her grip in places, but she pressed forward with grim determination, finally reaching the upper platform that offered exactly the vantage point she had promised Gareth. From this elevated position, she could see the full scope of the confrontation below. Damien remained motionless in the courtyard's center, still engaged in tense conversation with Alaric, while the dozen hostile fighters maintained their careful perimeter, weapons ready, attention fixed entirely on the exchange between the two leaders. None of them had thought to check the crumbling tower above, exactly as Elena had hoped. She scanned the ground near the tower's base and found what she needed: several loose stones, remnants of the structure's ancient decay, perfect for creating noise without inflicting harm. She gathered a handful, calculating the angle carefully, and hurled them toward the far side of the courtyard, away from Damien's position, aiming for a cluster of dense underbrush that would amplify the sound of impact. The stones landed with a series of sharp cracks and rustling movement that immediately drew the attention of the nearest fighters. Several turned instinctively toward the disturbance, weapons raised, formation fracturing, just slightly, as attention divided between the primary confrontation and this new, unexpected distraction. It was enough. Gareth's signal came instantly, and the hidden archers loosed their arrows in a coordinated volley, striking 3 of Alaric's fighters before any of them could fully process what had happened. Chaos erupted through the courtyard as the remaining fighters scattered for cover, some returning fire toward the ruins where the archers had revealed their position, others rushing to protect Alaric himself. Damien moved the instant the first arrow struck, closing the distance toward Tobias with predatory speed, his hesitation entirely gone now that the confrontation had shifted into open conflict. Alaric, caught between defending himself and maintaining control of his hostage, made a critical error, loosening his grip just enough for Damien to seize the opportunity. What followed happened almost too quickly for Elena to track from her elevated vantage point. Damien's fist connected with the arm restraining Tobias, breaking the hold entirely, and in the same fluid motion, he pulled his cousin free and shoved him toward the relative safety of a nearby collapsed wall, shielding him with his own body, as more arrows flew overhead and shouts of chaos filled the courtyard. Alaric, freed from the burden of maintaining his hostage, drew a blade from beneath his cloak, dark and gleaming, with something Elena immediately recognized as more of the same poison that had nearly killed Damien weeks earlier. Her stomach dropped with horror as she watched the 2 men circle each other in the chaos, Damien's honest strength facing off against a blade coated in something that could transform even the smallest wound into a fatal catastrophe. "Damien, the blade is poisoned," she shouted from her elevated position, unable to remain silent while such critical information might mean the difference between victory and death. Her voice carried clearly across the chaos, and she watched Damien's eyes flick briefly toward her position, surprise, and something like exasperated affection crossing his features, even in the midst of mortal combat, before his focus snapped back fully to the immediate threat Alaric posed. He adjusted his stance instantly, careful now to avoid any contact with the poisoned blade, circling with the patient, calculating movement of a predator who understood exactly how dangerous his opponent's weapon truly was. Alaric lunged, blade flashing in the morning light, and Damien sidestepped with fluid precision, close enough to counter but careful to avoid the deadly edge. The exchange continued for several tense minutes, both men testing each other's defenses, while around them the broader battle continued, Gareth's archers and Damien's remaining supporters gradually overwhelming Alaric's scattered fighters through superior coordination and the element of surprise that Elena's distraction had provided. Finally Damien found his opening. As Alaric lunged again, overcommitting slightly in his eagerness to land a decisive strike, Damien caught his wrist in an iron grip, twisting sharply enough to force the poisoned blade from his opponent's fingers. It clattered against the ancient stones, and before Alaric could recover his balance, Damien's other hand closed around his throat, pinning him against the crumbling remains of an old wall, with enough force to still any further resistance. "It ends here," Damien said, his voice low and dangerous, gold eyes blazing with barely restrained fury as he stared down his enemy. "Your grievance against my father is not mine to answer for through violence against my pack. If you wanted justice, you could have sought it honestly." Alaric, pinned and defeated, managed something that might have been a bitter laugh despite his precarious position. "Honest justice rarely favors those without power, Alpha. I learned that lesson decades ago, watching my family lose everything to your father's ambition. Perhaps you understand that better than most, given how recently your own foolishness nearly cost you everything you claim to value." The words struck closer to their intended target than Elena suspected Alaric had hoped, and she watched Damien's grip tighten fractionally before he forced himself to release it, stepping back with visible effort as restraint overcame the urge for vengeance that surely burned within him after weeks of danger and manipulation. "Bind him," Damien ordered the warriors now converging on the scene, the battle having concluded decisively in the pack's favor. Alaric's remaining fighters either captured or fled into the surrounding forest. He will face judgment before the full pack council, not die here in these ruins by my own hand, however tempting that outcome might be. As warriors moved to secure the defeated enemy, Elena finally allowed herself to descend from the tower, legs trembling with the aftermath of adrenaline and fear, relief flooding through her chest as she confirmed with her own eyes that Damien remained unharmed, that Tobias sat safely against the collapsed wall, shaken but alive, that the confrontation which had threatened to claim so much had ultimately ended in victory rather than tragedy. Damien crossed the courtyard the moment he spotted her, closing the distance between them with quick, purposeful strides, and before Elena could fully process what was happening, his arms wrapped around her in an embrace that spoke of relief too overwhelming for words. His face pressed against her hair, breath ragged against her ear. "You could have been killed," he murmured, voice rough with emotion he made no effort to hide. "Climbing that tower, exposing yourself to danger without any weapon or protection. Do you have any understanding of how close I came to losing you today, on top of everything else?" Elena allowed herself, just for a moment, to lean into the embrace, to feel the solid warmth of him against her, alive and whole, despite everything that had threatened to take him from her over these past terrifying weeks. "I could say the same about you," she murmured back. "Walking into that courtyard alone, facing a poisoned blade without hesitation. I had to," Damien said, pulling back just enough to look down at her, gold eyes searching her face with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Tobias needed protecting, and I could not simply stand aside while his life hung in the balance." "And I could not simply stand aside while yours did," Elena said quietly, the admission slipping free before she could fully consider its implications. 3 months of carefully guarded distance crumbling in the aftermath of shared danger and survival. For a long moment, neither of them spoke further, standing amid the chaos of the aftermath, warriors moving around them, securing prisoners, and tending to minor injuries, while between them, something long broken seemed, tentatively and cautiously, to begin knitting itself back together. The journey back to the pack grounds carried a different weight than the tense ride out that morning. Warriors escorted Alaric in heavy restraints, his composed arrogance from the confrontation, replaced now by sullen silence, though his eyes tracked every detail of the surrounding forest with the calculating attention of a man already searching for some future opportunity to escape or negotiate his way free. Tobias rode close beside his cousin, still shaken from his ordeal but otherwise unharmed, occasionally glancing toward Damien with the kind of gratitude that needed no words to convey. Elena rode near the rear of the procession, exhaustion finally catching up with her now that the immediate danger had passed, adrenaline draining away, and leaving her limbs heavy and trembling with the aftermath of everything the morning had demanded of her. Gareth fell into step beside her horse partway through the journey, his expression carrying a complicated mixture of relief and lingering reprimand. "That was reckless," he said, though his tone lacked any real heat. The words offered more as acknowledgement than genuine criticism. "Climbing that tower alone, without proper protection, without informing anyone of your exact plan before executing it. It worked," Elena said simply, too tired for extensive justification. "It worked," Gareth agreed, a reluctant smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "You have good instincts for someone who insists she is only a healer, Elena. Have you ever considered that your talents might extend beyond bandages and salves? I have enough to manage keeping this pack healthy, without adding tactical warfare to my responsibilities," Elena said dryly, though she appreciated the compliment despite her exhaustion. The pack council convened that same afternoon, gathering in the Great Hall to formally address the situation with Alaric, his crimes laid bare before the assembled leadership, the poisoning of the Alpha King, the manipulation and coercion of Marcus through threats against his family, the kidnapping of Tobias, the ambush prepared for the confrontation at the eastern ruins. Alaric stood before the council in chains, his earlier arrogance somewhat diminished by the reality of his circumstances, though he offered no denial of any accusation presented against him. "You have caused significant harm to this pack," Damien said, addressing him formally before the gathered council members, his voice carrying the weight of judgment rather than the personal fury Elena had witnessed during their earlier confrontation. "Poison, manipulation, kidnapping, attempted murder. These are not minor grievances, Alaric, however legitimate your family's original claims against my father's expansion may have been. I do not deny my actions," Alaric said, his composure returning somewhat, now that the immediate danger of the confrontation had passed, replaced by something almost resigned. "I knew the risks when I began this endeavor. I accept whatever judgment this council deems appropriate." The council deliberated for the better part of an hour, weighing the severity of his crimes against the legitimate historical grievance that had originally motivated his actions, a complexity that made simple judgment more difficult than Elena had initially anticipated. Ultimately, the decision reached was exile rather than execution, permanent banishment from cross-pact territory and all allied lands, along with a formal commitment from Damien to investigate and address the original territorial dispute that had sparked his family's decades-old resentment in the first place. "Your family's grievance deserves genuine examination," Damien said, as the judgment was finalized, addressing Alaric directly one final time. "I will send investigators to review the historical claims regarding the territory my father absorbed 2 generations ago. If legitimate injustice occurred, appropriate restitution will be considered, not because you have earned it through violence, but because it is the right course of action, regardless of how poorly you chose to pursue it." Alaric's expression flickered with something unreadable, surprise perhaps, or grudging respect, before he was led away by the warriors tasked with escorting him beyond the Pact's borders, his exile beginning immediately and permanently. As the council dispersed and the great hall gradually emptied, Elena found herself lingering near the entrance, watching Damien remain seated at the head of the long table, shoulders slumped slightly with the accumulated exhaustion of weeks spent fighting an enemy that had nearly cost him everything he valued. "You handled that with more mercy than I expected," she said quietly, approaching the table as the last council members filed out. Damien looked up, something softening in his expression at the sight of her. "My father's ambition created this entire crisis, whatever role Alaric's own choices played in how he ultimately responded to it. Exiling him without acknowledging that truth would only ensure his grievance passes to another generation, another cycle of violence born from unaddressed injustice." "That is wise leadership," Elena said, meaning it fully. "It is leadership I nearly failed to provide," Damien said, his voice carrying a weight of self-reflection that Elena had rarely heard from him before these past turbulent weeks. 3 months ago, I let fear drive a decision that nearly destroyed everything I claimed to value. This entire crisis exists, partly because my own foolishness created an opening for Alaric to exploit. I am trying, Elena, to learn from that mistake, rather than simply moving past it unchanged." Elena crossed the remaining distance between them, settling into the chair beside his at the long table, exhaustion and lingering emotion from the day's events making her braver than her usual careful reserve typically allowed. "You saved Tobias today. You showed restraint with Alaric when vengeance would have been easier, and perhaps understandable. You are already proving yourself different from the man who let fear speak for him beneath that full moon 3 months ago." Damien turned to face her fully, gold eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her breath catch, despite everything her body had already endured that day. "Does that mean there is hope, Elena? For us, I mean. Not simply for the Pact's safety, or my own growth as a leader, but for whatever exists between us, that neither poison nor exile, nor 3 months of silence has managed to fully extinguish." Elena's heart pounded, 3 months of carefully constructed walls trembling under the weight of everything the day had revealed, everything he had shown her about the man he was capable of becoming, when fear no longer dictated his choices. But dignity, the same dignity that had carried her through that terrible night of rejection, without a single tear shed before the watching pack, would not allow her to surrender everything, simply because danger and adrenaline had softened her guard. "Hope is not the same as certainty," she said carefully, though she made no move to create distance between them, allowing the moment to stretch, rather than retreating, into the safety of professional composure. "You hurt me deeply, Damien. Today does not erase that, however much I admire the man who fought for his cousin and showed mercy to his enemy. I am not asking for erasure," Damien said quietly. "I am asking for the chance to keep proving myself worthy of whatever we might rebuild, for however long that process takes." Elena studied his face for a long moment, searching for any trace of the fear-driven cowardice that had once made him choose rejection over vulnerability, and found instead something steadier, something that had been forged through weeks of crisis, into a version of himself that finally seemed willing to face difficulty rather than flee from it. "Prove it then," she said finally, allowing herself, for the first time since that painful night beneath the full moon, to imagine a future that might include this man, without the shadow of his earlier rejection, hanging permanently over every possibility. "Not with words, Damien. With time, and consistency, and the kind of patience that does not falter when things grow difficult again." "I can do that," Damien said, something like genuine hope brightening his exhausted features for the first time in weeks. "I intend to do exactly that, for as long as it takes." Outside the great hall, the sun had begun its descent toward evening, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose, and as Elena finally rose to return to her duties at the healing house, she felt something shift within her chest that she had not allowed herself to feel since the rejection. A fragile, cautious warmth that dared to hope, however carefully, that perhaps the worst of this ordeal had finally passed, and something better might yet be built from its ashes. The pack, too, seemed to sense the shift in atmosphere as evening settled over the grounds. Warriors who had spent weeks moving with tense, watchful caution now relaxed into something closer to their ordinary rhythms, the immediate threat finally resolved. Their Alpha King restored fully to health, and clearly, visibly changed by everything the crisis had demanded of him. Marcus, still recovering from his own injuries, sent word through Gareth, expressing his intention to remain with the pack once fully healed. Having earned a measure of forgiveness through his eventual honesty despite his earlier coerced betrayal, and his sister settled quietly into the territory, grateful for the protection Damien had extended without hesitation once her situation became known. It was not a perfect resolution. Alaric's exile did not undo the fear and pain his actions had caused, and the historical grievance that had originally motivated his campaign would require careful, patient work to address fully in the months ahead. But as Elena walked back toward the healing house through the gathering dusk, she allowed herself to believe, for the first time in 3 long months, that healing, both for the pack and for whatever remained of her own broken heart, might finally be possible. 3 weeks passed following Alaric's exile, and with each passing day, Elena watched Damien make good on his promise, with a consistency that slowly, carefully, began to rebuild the trust she had guarded so fiercely since his rejection. He did not push for more than she offered. He did not demand immediate forgiveness, or attempt grand gestures designed to sweep away 3 months of pain through sheer romantic spectacle. Instead, he showed up, day after day, in small and steady ways that spoke louder than any dramatic declaration could have managed. He walked with her some mornings as she gathered herbs along the forest edge, carrying her satchel without being asked, listening genuinely as she explained the properties of each plant she collected. He sought her counsel on pack matters that extended well beyond healing, valuing her judgment on issues of diplomacy and community welfare, in ways he had never done before the rejection had forced them both to reconsider what they valued in each other. He apologized, not once in a single sweeping confession, but repeatedly, in small moments when old patterns of fear threatened to resurface, catching himself and choosing vulnerability instead of the walls he had once hidden behind. Slowly, the guarded distance Elena had maintained began to soften into something warmer, though she remained careful not to rush the process, mindful of the dignity that had carried her through the darkest months of her life, and unwilling to abandon that hard-won strength, simply because hope had begun creeping back into her heart. The pack, too, had settled into a new rhythm following the crisis, the immediate danger resolved, but its lessons clearly absorbed by every member who had witnessed how close their Alpha King had come to losing everything, both to poison and to his own earlier foolishness. Investigators Damien had dispatched to examine the historical territorial dispute returned with findings that confirmed at least partial legitimacy to Alaric's family grievance, and Damien moved forward with formal reparations, a decision that earned him respect throughout the region, as word spread of an Alpha King willing to acknowledge and correct his father's past mistakes, rather than defend them out of stubborn pride. It was during the pack's autumn gathering, a traditional celebration marking the change of seasons that brought every member of the community together beneath the open sky, that everything Elena had carefully guarded finally came undone in a single unexpected moment. The gathering had begun, as these celebrations always did, with shared food and music, warriors and healers and elders mingling freely, without the usual formality that governed daily pack life. Elena had settled near the edge of the gathering, with several of the healers she had trained, enjoying a rare evening, free from the tension that had dominated so much of the past 2 months, when Damien rose from his seat at the head table and moved to stand before the assembled crowd, requesting their attention with a raised hand. The gathering quieted gradually, conversation fading as pack members turned their attention toward their Alpha King, curious about what had prompted this unplanned address during what should have been an evening of simple celebration. 3 months ago, beneath a full moon, much like the one rising above us tonight, I made the gravest mistake of my life, Damien began, his voice carrying clearly across the hushed crowd, and Elena felt her heart stutter with sudden dawning understanding of exactly where this was heading. I stood before this entire pack and rejected a bond that had chosen me, driven by fear rather than wisdom, by the ghost of my parents' failed mating, rather than any genuine assessment of what Elena Vasquez and I might have built together. Whispers rippled through the crowd, every eye now turning toward Elena, who felt heat rise in her cheeks despite her best efforts to maintain composure under the sudden weight of public attention. She had not anticipated this. Nothing in their private conversations over these past weeks had suggested Damien intended anything so public, so irreversible in its exposure. I watched her accept that rejection with a dignity I did not deserve, Damien continued, his voice thickening with emotion he made no effort to hide. Gold eyes fixed entirely on Elena now, as though the rest of the gathered crowd had ceased to exist entirely. She did not beg. She did not weep before all of you, though I know now the pain my words caused her ran deeper than she ever allowed any of us to witness. She simply accepted my foolishness with more grace than I had any right to expect, and walked away with a strength that has haunted me every single day since. Elena rose slowly from her seat, uncertain what to do with the sudden focus of the entire gathering, her heart hammering against her ribs, as Damien crossed the distance between them, with deliberate, unhurried steps, every eye in the crowd tracking his movement with breathless anticipation. These past weeks have shown me exactly what I nearly threw away, Damien said, stopping before her now, close enough that she could see the raw vulnerability etched across his features, none of the careful composure he typically wore as Alpha King remaining visible in this moment. She fought for this pack when she owed us nothing. She climbed a crumbling tower without hesitation to save warriors who had no claim on her loyalty beyond simple compassion. She healed my body from poison meant to destroy me, and somehow, despite everything I had already done to hurt her, she found the strength to care whether I lived or died. His voice caught, and for a moment, the Alpha King, who commanded absolute authority throughout 3 territories, stood before his entire pack, visibly, unmistakably losing the careful control that had defined every public appearance of his life. Tears, actual tears, gathered in his gold eyes, and the gathered crowd fell into a silence so complete that Elena could hear her own pulse pounding in her ears, every pack member present witnessing something none of them had ever imagined possible from a leader who had built his entire reputation on unshakable command. "I do not deserve a second chance," Damien said, his voice breaking fully now, raw and unguarded in a way that stripped away every layer of alpha authority, and left only the man beneath, desperate and honest, in his vulnerability. "But I am asking for one regardless, before this entire pack as witness, because I refuse to spend one more day pretending that I can simply move forward without her beside me. Elena Vasquez, I withdraw my rejection. I ask you, before everyone who witnessed my foolishness 3 months ago, to consider whether the bond between us might yet be worth rebuilding, not because duty demands it, but because I choose you, fully and without fear, exactly as I should have chosen you from the very beginning." The silence stretching across the gathering felt endless, every pack member holding their collective breath, waiting to see whether the woman who had refused to beg for a rejected bond would now accept its unexpected reversal offered so publicly, so completely stripped of the pride and fear that had governed Damien's earlier choice. Elena stood frozen for a long moment, overwhelmed by the weight of the moment, by the raw emotion visible in Damien's expression, by the memory of that terrible night 3 months ago, when she had walked away with nothing but dignity to sustain her through the loneliness that followed. Every instinct urged caution, urged the same careful composure that had protected her through the darkest months of her life. But beneath that caution, something else stirred, something that had been growing steadily through these past weeks of witnessing Damien's genuine transformation, his consistent effort, his willingness to face difficulty, rather than flee from vulnerability, the way fear had once compelled him to do. "You hurt me," she said finally, her voice carrying clearly across the silent gathering, refusing to soften the truth simply because the moment demanded romantic resolution. "You hurt me deeply, Damien, and no single speech, however heartfelt, erases 3 months of walking through this pack, wondering what I had done wrong, wondering whether I had simply been unworthy of the bond that chose me." "I know," Damien said quietly, accepting the truth without flinching, without attempting to minimize or excuse the pain his earlier choice had caused. "I know, and I do not ask you to pretend otherwise. But these past weeks have shown me something too, Elena continued, and she watched hope flicker cautiously across his features as her tone shifted, softening slightly despite herself. They have shown me a man willing to change, willing to face fear instead of running from it, willing to fight for something he once discarded, rather than simply accepting its loss as inevitable. That man, Damien, is someone I find myself, despite every careful wall I built to protect my own heart, still wanting to know better. A collective breath seemed to release across the gathered crowd, tension shifting subtly towards something closer to hopeful anticipation, though Elena remained aware of every watching eye, every held breath waiting for her final answer. I will not simply accept a bond restored through a single public confession, however moving, she said, meeting Damien's gaze steadily, despite the emotion tightening her own throat now. But I am willing to let you continue proving yourself, exactly as we agreed weeks ago, without the pressure of expectation that a moment like this might otherwise create. Slowly, Damien. Honestly. Without fear driving either of our choices this time. Something like profound relief washed across Damien's features, and though Elena had not offered the immediate, complete reconciliation the gathered pack might have hoped to witness, the promise implicit in her words, the door left deliberately open rather than closed forever, seemed to satisfy something desperate and uncertain in his expression. Slowly then, he agreed, his voice thick with emotion he no longer bothered concealing before his assembled pack. For as long as it takes, however long you need, I will be here, choosing you honestly, every single day, until you trust that choice as fully as I have finally learned to trust it myself. The gathering erupted into quiet murmurs of approval and relief as the tension of the unexpected moment finally began to dissipate, pack members exchanging glances of shared emotion at having witnessed something so raw and unguarded from the leader they had always known as controlled and formidable above all else. Gareth, watching from near the head table, allowed himself a rare, unguarded smile, while Marcus, seated further back among the recovering warriors, offered Elena a small nod of genuine happiness, despite whatever complicated feelings he might still carry regarding his own role in the events that had led to this moment. As the celebration gradually resumed around them, music and conversation slowly filling the space that the confrontation had briefly silenced, Damien remained standing close beside Elena, neither of them quite ready to fully rejoin the festivities, both still absorbing the weight of everything the moment had finally, publicly acknowledged. That was reckless, Elena said finally, echoing Gareth's earlier words to her with a small, genuine smile beginning to soften her expression, despite everything the evening had demanded of her composure. Announcing something so personal before the entire gathered pack, without warning me first. Some things deserve to be witnessed properly, Damien said, gold eyes warm with an emotion he no longer bothered to guard. You accepted my rejection with dignity before this entire pack. I could not offer you anything less than an equally public acknowledgement of how wrong I had been. Elena studied his face for a long moment, taking in the sincerity written across every feature, the vulnerability he had chosen to display, before an audience that could have easily mocked or judged such an unguarded display from their formidable alpha king. Whatever remained uncertain about their future, whatever careful rebuilding still lay ahead of them, she found herself, for the first time since that painful night 3 months ago, allowing genuine hope to settle fully into her chest, without the immediate instinct to guard against its inevitable disappointment. Slowly, she reminded him softly, though her hand found his without conscious decision, fingers intertwining in a gesture that spoke more honestly than any further words might have managed. Slowly, Damien agreed, tightening his grip gently around her hand, as the autumn celebration continued around them, the entire pack having witnessed a transformation few among them would ever forget. Their alpha king's carefully guarded control, finally, genuinely broken open by love rather than danger, choosing vulnerability over pride, in a moment that would be remembered throughout the territory for generations to come. Winter arrived early that year, dusting the pack territory in a soft blanket of white that transformed the familiar grounds into something quiet and pristine, and with its arrival came a season of steady, patient rebuilding that Elena had never quite allowed herself to imagine possible during the darkest weeks following Damien's rejection. He kept his promise, not through grand gestures or repeated public declarations, but through the accumulated weight of small, consistent choices made day after day, week after week, until the trust Elena had guarded so carefully began to feel less like a fortress under siege and more like a foundation being deliberately, patiently rebuilt stone by careful stone. She watched him govern with a wisdom sharpened by everything the crisis had taught him, addressing not only the reparations owed to Alaric's family, but reviewing every territorial dispute inherited from his father's ambition, seeking genuine resolution, rather than simply defending old claims out of stubborn pride. The Pack Council, initially cautious about such significant departures from established practice, gradually came to respect an Alpha King willing to acknowledge past wrongs, rather than perpetuate them. And Damien's standing throughout the region grew not despite his admitted mistakes, but because of how honestly he addressed them. Marcus remained with the pack through the winter months, his sister settling comfortably into the community, and though the shadow of his earlier coerced betrayal never fully vanished from pack memory, his consistent honesty and genuine remorse gradually earned him a measure of trust that allowed him to rebuild a life within the territory he had once nearly helped destroy. He and Elena settled into an easy friendship, free now of the complicated tension that had once existed between them, both grateful the crisis had ultimately revealed truths that allowed clearer, more honest relationships to form in its aftermath. Elena continued her work as the pack's healer, her reputation only strengthened by everything she had proven during the crisis, her willingness to face danger directly when the situation demanded it earning her a respect throughout the territory that extended well beyond her considerable skill with herbs and bandages. Younger healers she trained looked to her, now not simply as a teacher of medicine, but as an example of quiet strength that had weathered devastating pain without losing its essential dignity. And through it all, Damien remained steadily, patiently present, never pushing for more than she offered, never allowing old fears to resurface and drive careless words or hasty withdrawal, choosing instead the harder, more honest path of earning back what he had once so foolishly discarded. It was on a clear winter evening, months after the autumn gathering, where he had first publicly acknowledged his mistake, before the entire pack, that Elena found herself walking with him, along the same forest path where she had once gathered herbs as a young girl, snow crunching softly beneath their boots, breath fogging in the cold evening air. "Do you remember what I told you, that first morning after the poison, when you asked me why I stayed by your side through that terrible night?" she asked, breaking the comfortable silence that had settled between them. "You said protecting me that night was instinct," Damien said, glancing toward her with the warm attentiveness that had become so familiar over these past months. "But protecting me every day after was a choice." "It still is," Elena said quietly, stopping to face him fully beneath the bare branches of an old oak tree, its silhouette stark and beautiful against the darkening winter sky. "Every single day, Damien, choosing to trust you again has been exactly that, a choice, made deliberately, not because the bond compels it, but because you have earned it, through everything you have shown me since that night." Damien's expression softened with an emotion too complex for simple words, gold eyes reflecting the last light of the setting sun, as he reached for her hands, holding them gently between his own, despite the winter cold biting at exposed skin. "And where does that choice stand now, Elena? After everything, after all these months of patient rebuilding, where do we stand?" Elena felt her heart pound with the same nervous anticipation she remembered from before the rejection had ever occurred, before fear had torn apart something precious, and forced them both through months of painful separation and difficult growth. But this time, unlike that terrible night beneath the full moon, she felt no dread accompanying the vulnerability of the moment, only a quiet, settled certainty that had been building steadily through every honest conversation, every consistent choice, every small act of trust rebuilt between them over these past months. "I choose you," she said simply, echoing the words he had once spoken before the entire gathered pack, though now offered privately, intimately, without the weight of public witness required to make them true. "Not because a bond compels it, not because dignity demands I prove myself unbothered by what happened between us, but because I have watched you become someone worthy of that choice, Damien. Someone I want to build a future alongside, honestly, and without fear, governing either of our decisions." The relief and joy that broke across Damien's features in that moment stripped away every trace of the formidable Alpha King persona he wore before his pack, leaving only the man beneath, vulnerable and grateful, and genuinely, completely happy, for what felt like the first time in longer than either of them could easily remember. He pulled her close, and this time, when their lips met beneath the bare branches of that old oak tree, it carried none of the uncertainty that had shadowed every interaction between them since that painful night of rejection. Only the settled warmth of two people who had fought through genuine adversity to arrive, finally, at something real and lasting. Word spread through the pack quickly once they returned from their walk, hand in hand, the quiet joy evident in both their expressions leaving little room for speculation about what had transpired beneath the winter sky. The pack, having witnessed every painful stage of their separation and slow reconciliation, greeted the news with genuine celebration, understanding intuitively that this particular happiness had been earned through months of honest struggle, rather than simply granted through easy circumstance. Their formal remating ceremony took place the following spring, beneath a full moon much like the one that had witnessed Damien's original rejection, though this time the gathered crowd held nothing but joyful anticipation, rather than the shocked silence of that earlier devastating night. Elena stood before the pack in ceremonial dress, Damien beside her, both of them carrying the visible marks of everything they had survived together, poison and betrayal, and painful separation, transformed now into the foundation of something far stronger than either of them might have built without first weathering such genuine adversity. "Do you accept this bond?" the pack elder asked, following the traditional ceremony that governed every mating within their territory, though the question carried far deeper weight for these two particular participants than it typically held for couples who had never faced such devastating rejection and painstaking reconciliation. "I accept it fully," Damien said, his voice carrying clearly across the assembled pack, steady and certain, in a way that bore no resemblance to the fear-driven uncertainty that had once governed his choices. "Without hesitation, without the shadow of old fears clouding my judgment. I choose Elena Vasquez, completely and permanently, as my mate and equal partner in leading this pack forward." "I accept it fully as well," Elena said, meeting his gaze with the same steady certainty, remembering the dignity that had carried her through the darkest months of her life, now transformed into the foundation of a joy she had once believed lost to her entirely. "I choose Damien Cross, not because circumstance or bond compels it, but because I have witnessed the man he chose to become, when tested by genuine crisis, and I find him worthy of everything I once feared to offer again." The pack celebration that followed stretched long into the night, music and laughter filling the grounds where months earlier fear and uncertainty had once dominated every conversation. Gareth offered a formal toast to his alpha and new alpha queen, his earlier reprimands about recklessness forgotten in favor of genuine celebration for two people who had earned their happiness through honest struggle. Marcus and his sister joined the festivities, as valued members of the community they had once nearly helped destroy, their own redemption complete, in the warmth of a pack willing to extend forgiveness to those who proved genuinely deserving of it. Elena Vasquez, who had once accepted rejection without begging, who had walked away from devastating heartbreak with nothing but dignity to sustain her, who had refused to let fear or desperation compromise her sense of self-worth, even in her darkest moments, stood now beside the Alpha King, who had once lost her through his own foolish fear and won her back through months of patient, honest devotion. The pack had fallen silent once before, shocked into stunned quiet when their Alpha King lost control before them, first through devastating rejection, and later through vulnerable, tearful confession. But the silence that fell now, as Damien gathered Elena close beneath the full moon and pressed a gentle kiss to her forehead before their assembled community, carried nothing but reverent joy, every witness understanding they had watched something rare and precious take root. A love strong enough to survive its own near destruction, patient enough to rebuild what fear had once torn apart, and honest enough, finally, to choose itself completely, without hesitation, without reservation, and without any shadow of doubt remaining to threaten the future they had both fought so hard to earn.